Welcome, workers and friends. Welcome back to Anti-imperialist America. I'm your host, Dust James, the Marxist-Leninist truck driver. I'm coming to you live from my humble home in rural North Carolina. Thank you for coming in. Please share this out on Twitter, share this out on the Facebook, share this out to your favorite Facebook group, share this out to your favorite Facebook message board. And just as I tell you to do that, I'm about to do the same. I'm always big on do as I say, don't do as I do. But I'm about to do is I do as I say. All right, here we go. Let me get up here and make sure this is public. And welcome everybody. Thanks for piling in. I don't know why I just switched. I was using BeLive forever, and then I switched over to StreamYard. And I like all my stuff to be public. I want as many people to watch this as they can. You know, I already use a stage name, Dust James. It's pretty close to my actual name. Protects my last name, protects people getting to my job, you know. But other than that, I mean, I'm taking a risk doing this, but it is what it is. You know, it's a calculated risk. I want more people to hear the message of socialism. I want more people to engage with these ideas. I want people to disagree with me to get in the comments and disagree with me. If I'm wrong about something and you tell me better and you can convince me, then I have moved forward and I have a better understanding. I support robust democratic debate and discussion. That is how we come to terms with the issues and grow our minds, grow as people, and develop our positions. So, anyways, I always do this on BeLive, and I finally switched over to StreamYard, and I like my stuff to be public, but every time I go to stream, it is private. So I gotta go in here and make it public, and then when I make it public, then then we can then we can get the comments. If people want to put comments in, that'd be great. I can see what y'all are doing. There you go. I got YouTube. I got Facebook working. Let me check the YouTube, see if that's working. Everybody settle in. We got a great show today. It's a beautiful Friday evening. I got off work, listened to the Willie Nelson cassette on the way home. Good stuff. Earlier, Willie Nelson been just kind of puts me in the mood after work to calm down, relax. End of the year coming up. We got the stress of the holidays. Christmas coming up. Everybody's trying to get their Christmas presents. Everybody's trying to get their family together. And if they ain't got family, they're all depressed about not having a family, or the family that kind of fell through the cracks or ain't talked to in a minute. Everybody, you know, a lot of folks get depressed around this time. It is what it is. A bit of bad news. Julian Assange is facing extradition to the United States. That is absolutely horrible. I mean, it's obviously it was a kangaroo court. It was messed up. It shows a lack of sovereignty from the British people. The American government can boss the British government around. So there's a lack of sovereignty on their part. It shows a lack of sovereignty on the Australian government's part, that they can't protect, they're not allowed to protect their own citizens. If the U.S. wants them, shows the real power of imperialism led by U.S. imperialism. And it shows the absolute hypocrisy. And it shows the absolute absence of a free press in the West, or a free press in general, or even a or even a legitimate justice system in the West. Julian Assange is a hero. Julian Assange exposed the wars of the most brutal empire on earth, the U.S. empire. I remember looking at that YouTube video with that helicopter where that pilot was making fun about shooting children. And then after he made fun about shooting children, he said, oh, they shouldn't have brought their children to a battle site. It's not a battle site, that's their home. The U.S. was the invaders in their country. And then, after they shot up an ambulance, come to shoot up the ambulance, it was absolutely disgusting video that made a splash, that made people come out against the war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan. They spent so much money in Afghanistan, trillions and trillions of dollars, that could have went into the educational system, that could have went in the healthcare system. We just renewed our healthcare on the marketplace, and it's like thousands of dollars in deductibles. Stuff I don't even understand. You got these. Recently, I was watching up on the Jimmy Dore show, this surprise medical billing, where even an emergency situation, not emergency or non-emergency situation, if you go to get medical care, there might be components of that medical care, even though that doctor or that facility is in your network, they might run this test or that test, or they might, an anesthesiologist will put you under so you don't feel pain during an operation. That ain't covered. And then, like 6 months later, the year later, you get a bill for a few grand up in the mail. Ruins your credit. And there was supposed to be a bill to stop that from happening. And the Democrats and the Republicans got together, because they're both paid by the same insurance company, to stop that bill. And now, we still got to pay we go to a doctor's office. Working people are scared to seek medical care because it could mean thousands of dollars in debt. And the prices are outrageous, insane. A good shout out to all the people joining me. Shout out to Gordon, Fiala. Nice to have you here. I like to go through the comments. I got a spiel. Name of today's show is Popular Power is Never Revisionist. I'm going to get that into a minute. But if people want to help me get settled in, put some comments in the comment section. I might go over and read a few of these before I start. If they renew the healthcare and educational system, they can't use poverty excuse for the class division. Exactly. Right on, Gordon. That's a very decent point. They blame the poor. Right on, right on. We need critical thinking. Looks and sounds good. Can't chat. Got to put in listen only mode because of stuff to do. Well, thank you for listening. Thanks for tuning in. Everybody that is tuning in, make sure you share this out. Let me share this out to a few places before I get into the main conversation, the main topic, the feature presentation, as they say in the movies. I'm going to share this out to a few places right quick, give you all the same to do as well. Man, Friday. Shoot, I'm actually a little tired. I'm not having a beer. I'm having this weird old fancy hop water. Ain't got no alcohol, but it tastes like hops. It's kind of interesting. That's that bitter, fruity kind of flavor that I'm a little bit addicted to over the years, trying all them damn craft beers all in the bars all around the country. Gives me a non-alcoholic version of it. I'm actually a little tired. I woke up real early this morning. So I was going to share this video to a few places, then get into our conversation. Ba-boom. Share this to my working class revolt. If you are on Facebook, I recommend that you join the Working Class Revolt Facebook group. I also suggest that people like the Anti-imperialist America Facebook page. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to me. Dust James. Just Google Dust James, Anti-imperialist America. Please subscribe to me on YouTube as well. I think I'll just share this out to a few more places and I'll get into my main topic of discussion. Very good to have everybody here. Looks like we got another comment here from Gordon Fiala. Well, honestly, what would they do if everyone was wealthy and educated? With no jobs, it would be pretty hard to excuse the class divisions. Exactly. A lot of they tell you that school, a lot of education, they call it education, but a lot of what so-called higher education is just hoops is a filtering process. That way, there's only certain number of jobs that pay slightly more, and it isn't exactly all about the training, because half the time you get through the school and you go do the job, and half the stuff you learn on the job. So if you didn't really learn how to do the job while you was in the school, but you need a degree, why did you have to require the school in the first place? And that's because it's a filtration process. They want to keep a large section of the population as low-wage workers. So they invent this so-called title of unskilled labor, when in reality, all jobs are skilled. One of the jobs they called unskilled is agricultural work. And I've worked in the fields. I picked watermelon, picked blueberries, and you got to know how to pick the fruit without damaging the plants. You have to be able to put your body in that position. You have to be able to stand those elements. And that takes time to get and understand those jobs. Most of the time you get on a job, even these so-called unskilled labor jobs, they want you to have a number of years of experience. They want you to have a number of years of experience because that is a skilled job. Any job that requires any amount of experience is a skilled job. But they call it unskilled labor to devalue it, so they don't have to pay what it's being worth, so they continue to exploit us. They do a lot of manipulations of vocabulary where they call college higher education. In reality, it's a filtration process. I'm not saying, I ain't knocking, they do teach you some stuff in there, and lawyers and doctors, there's stuff they learn there they're going to use, but for a big part of it really is simply a filtration process. And that filtration process, favors those who already have money and connections. The poor stay poor, the rich get richer. I mean, that's the way it is. Urgh. So I'm having this weird hop water. That's that nice bitter taste I'm addicted to, and the IPA beers, but in water format. That's why I'm of my senses when I'm talking to you guys. I mean, I can get on some subjects, but if I'm already tired, I already had a nice dinner. I had a nice, I had sopa de albondigas for dinner. My wife made it. I made dinner last night. Sopa de albondigas is kind of like a meatball stew. You kind of put eggs and garlic and maybe crackers in the meatballs. You have this kind of greasy, heavy stew. It's really good in the winter. And you put rice in the stew, chop up the meatball, eat it with a spoon. It's beautiful. It's good. And last night I cooked. I'm learning how to cook Chinese food. Before they never really had the ingredients for Chinese food in any of the stores, let alone the Walmart. I looked it up in the Walmart, and they got different curries, kung pao chicken, sesame seed chicken, lo mein. So I made a vegetable lo mein with sesame seed chicken grill last night. Brought that to work, and it was delicious. I'm finally figuring out how to cook food I like after being over the road for 7 years. I've been a truck driving since 2013, I believe. 7, 8 years. Been truck driving 8 years. 7 of that was over the road, and one of that has been recently. I've been local. And when I lived over the road, worked over the road, I would eat nothing but fast food. Started getting health problems. And now I'm home. I've been for a year. Never really been fully domesticated, as you say. And I'm finally learning how to cook healthy food for myself and trying to figure that out, trying to get my health in order. That's another thing that working people, especially truck drivers, put in sacrifices, get health problems just to survive, just to pay the bills, just to help their families that are struggling. I'd love to hear y'all stories too. How you guys struggling out there? What industry are you in? What state you live in? Bring it up. If you got a state or a town, I've probably been there, got a story about it. Put it in the comments. Let's talk about it. So here we go. I'm going to go right in now. If I think that was a good bit of icebreaker. Now we're going to get right directly into the subject. Popular power is never revisionist. Say that again. Popular power is never revisionist. Well, what is revisionism? Revisionism was originally a term that Bernstein applied to himself. He said he is not a Marxist, he is a revisionist. He had a famous slogan saying, "The movement is everything and the goal is nothing." He believed that we would reach socialism a through a step by step, brick by brick, brick by brick process of reforms. That if we get this and then we get that, and then we get this, if we get healthcare, if we get democratic rights, then we'll get to socialism. And that's what revisionism was. That was Bernstein. And Lenin wrote polemics against Bernstein for being a revisionist. And this is wrong. Marxism requires a kind of like a sea shift, a sea change event. You can be a revolution. It can be, vote. It requires a shift in power from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat, working class, or proletariat and a coalition of other classes and oppressed masses, with the proletariat being the main force within that coalition. I mean, that's what it requires, because the thing is, if the bourgeoisie is in power, and then let's say we get health care, but then they take away something else, or let's say we get health care, but you know the bourgeois system will always be a drain and a hold back on history, because as long as the bourgeoisie is firmly in power, they are never going to give up that power. So we were never going to have socialism. So it requires us taking power from them. And that requires building power and building mass organization. It requires building popular power. What is popular power? Well, people say, well, not all popular power is good. What if the majority of the people are homophobic? What if the majority of the people are xenophobic? What if the majority of the people are racist? You wouldn't want that sentiment and idea to be in power. And I most certainly would not. And those ideas might be popular, but I would never consider those ideas in power to be popular power, because these regressive, divisive ideas never empower the masses. Racism, sexism, these forces are always used by the ruling class to divide the people. So you're never gonna have, you're never gonna have a reaction. Popular power by nature is never reactionary. Popular power is empowering the people, is empowering the workers, and and to empower the workers and give the workers say over their economy and say over their government and say over their own lives, by de facto, you are going to have to repress the capitalist bourgeois state and forces, because the capitalist and the bourgeois forces are currently ruling over the masses of the people. So you will never have a popular capitalist regime. Popular power will always be a step forward. Now, there has been popular power that has come, into anti-imperialist states, but that was an empowerment of the masses. That was a step forward. Let's say a state, an oppressed nation, is still capitalist, but they kick out the elements of the bourgeoisie that have been bribed off by the imperialist countries, or the more like the monopoly capitalists of the imperialist countries. If they break their ties with them and actually do what is in the interest of the people, we actually do what, not even the people, if they simply do what is in the interests of their country, even though they are capitalists, they're going to come into conflict with the monopoly capitalists. This is why there's often a two-stage revolution. First, there's a bourgeois revolution, and then a socialist revolution. But I mean, it's kind of molded into each other. This day and age, in this ultra monopolyism, this super monopolyism, where even like Lenin would talk about, the number of factories with 500 are the biggest percentage now. But now we have like 5 families that control like the majority of the world's wealth and land resources, and can basically control governments, but all the Western powers, as well as all the governments that are under the boot of Western imperialism by U.S. imperialism. So you can have a popular movement, anti-imperialist movement, that is still, that the nationalist bourgeoisie is still a component of that. But to enable them to go against the monopoly capitalists, in the oppressor nations, they're going to have to mobilize the people. I mean, where are they going to go? I mean, all the money, all the corporations, when the imperialists go into a country, they did this in Mexico with NAFTA. They like to put the Mexican farmers out of business, and import cheap, subsidized monoculture corn. I mean, you might not think of agriculture as imperialism. Usually you think of military and war as imperialism. But agriculture is actually a huge way that imperialism works. Imperialism is not simply, you're not imperializing someone. Imperialism is a global system. It is a global political economic order, where a few monopoly capitalists, in this case, in our day and age, banking cartels, control the entire global economy. That is imperialism. Now, the wars are done to stop countries from escaping that global political economic order. Any country that tries to escape it, that then they have sabotage against them, they have coups performed against them, or they're outright militarily invaded. And that was the case with Gaddafi. Gaddafi was a Islamic socialist in Northern Africa and there's a good book put out by the Center for Political Innovation, his copy of the Green Book. You want to look into Muammar Gaddafi's understanding of socialism, how he helped develop socialism in our time period. I highly recommend this, with the introduction by Caleb Maupin. That's very good. He actually read that. If you want to hear that introduction, you can just put Caleb Maupin Green Book in Google, and he'll read that introduction for you as well. And if you like the introduction, you can buy the book as well. It has a little the font's a little small, but for a young reader, it's very nice, very handheld, nice page numbers and graphics as well. But Muammar Gaddafi escaped the political dominance of Western imperialism. They were using the oil. There was another instance of petro-socialism. They used, they call it the Green Book because Gaddafi actually greened the desert. A lot of the land in Libya was unusable. And through irrigation systems, they actually greened the desert and turned what was wasteland into prosperous land and fertile land through processes of watering the desert, huge, massive public infrastructure projects funded by oil money, petro-socialism. And he was destroyed. And he also was investing all over Africa, was going to change over to the gold standard. And he was an anti-imperialist and a socialist. Now, if you listen to the synthetic left and the Trotskyites, they're kind of glad he got killed off. But this new working class Marxist movement that I'm firmly a part of, and I believe a lot of folks here watching are a part of, we're not believing the bullshit of the synthetic left Trotskyite academics no more. We recognize Gaddafi as an anti-imperialist hero. We recognize his socialist system in the oppressed continent of Africa. And we completely and utterly condemn the war criminals. The war criminals like Obama and the Clintons, the Democrats and Republicans. So I'll continue and get into this. So I went into what is revisionism. Revisionism, Edward Bernstein, the movement is everything, the goal is not. So honestly, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. Sounds a lot like these faux Marxist groups out here, who go to the protest cage and they say, hey, we agree with Black Lives Matter and we're communists. Hey, we support the environmental movement and we're communists. Hey, it's a lot like tailism, tailing the movement. I read in when we were going over the foundations of Leninism, which we will continue our study on the foundations of Leninism this Saturday. And on this Saturday, we're going to be having one of our former co-hosts come back on, Keaton Mansfield, the John Brown volunteer who's currently down there in Texas, spreading the good word of socialism to good people of Texas. And he's going to be coming on. He's a 7th generation cattle farmer. And we're going to be talking about the peasant question. So don't miss that. Myself, David Fox, and the John Brown volunteer, Keaton Mansfield, will be studying the foundations of Leninism on the peasant question. And the peasant question is an interesting question as far as class goes, because peasants are oppressed and they're producers. They produce agriculture goods, but they own their land. So technically they're petty bourgeoisie, even though they're exploited and oppressed. And we're going to get into that and talk about that. And, Stalin, if you look at the hammer and sickle, that the sickle is for the agricultural workers. The hammer is for the industrial workers. So it really, and most of the country during the time of the Russian Revolution was actually peasants. So it was an alliance of the proletarian and the peasants that brought the Soviet Union into power. And this is similar with the Chinese Revolution. It wasn't simply the working class. They actually invited, technocrats and other people, peasants, technocrats. I think I'm not sure which classes are, but the 4 stars on the Chinese flag, along with the big star, are the different classes that made the coalition that came to power. But the working class is the main focus and the main class. even though the peasants were the majority in the Soviet Union, but we can get into that. So, popular power is never revisionist. So we went into Edward Bernstein version of revisionist. He actually gladly called himself a revisionist. We talked about how the synthetic left, the protest cage, has a lot to do with tailism and being isolated from the masses. And it's not about building popular movements. So what has anti-revisionism really become to mean? So after Lenin's time, revisionism kind of took on a different meaning when we started to see groups break off from the Communist Party USA. The Communist Party USA made an alliance with the Democratic Party under Roosevelt to fight against the fascists in the 1940s. This was the Popular Front, and I believe it was necessary at the time. But the Communist Party USA has never really stopped supporting the Democrats ever since the 1940s and 50s, even though fascism was defeated. And then the U.S. put fascists back in the power in Western Germany. And then the U.S. started using fascist tactics here and became I was already started in World War I and became the main hegemonic power. We're starting to see the beginnings of a multipolar world today. But the U.S. after World War II was the leader of the imperialist bloc, imperialism led by U.S. imperialism. So we had the defeat of the fascists. We had fascist scientists brought into our own government. So the policy of the Communist Party USA to continue to back the Democrats is absolutely horrible and wrong. And many principled forces within the Communist Party broke off from the Communist Party USA. And they did it at different times. And this was really a global movement. It's interesting. I believe today, 21st century socialism, today's socialism, I don't think we don't have to be like religious sects where we go back and trace our roots to this and trace our roots to that, trace our roots to this split. We have people coming to socialism on their own terms. You don't have to trace your own lineage back to a couple splits from the CPUSA. Even though I was a part of a group that could trace its lineage back to the original CPUSA from several different splits. But that kind of became the thing, and there was different time periods of splits from CPUSA, and this was happening all over the world. And so you had the idea is that some communist parties became revisionist. They became bourgeoisie. They gave up on the idea of revolution. So you can see how Bernstein's idea of revisionism, which he claimed to have, kind of different parties which became anti-revisionist and broke off from these other parties. You can see why, and there was also this kind of period of absolute dominance of imperialism led by U.S. imperialism. And you had in Europe, you had Euro-communism. It's like, we're not going to be like the evil Soviet Union, or we're not going to be like China. We're our own type of communists. And that was revisionism, in a sense. And then you had the Sino-Soviet split, where, China and Russia were working together, and then China and Russia were manipulated by the United States and put against each other. And the Soviet Union, sorry, the Soviet Union started acting more friendly to the U.S., and then China started acting more friendly to the U.S. China said it wasn't gonna, and actually China actually made the very bad decision up around the Cultural Revolution, which was another very adventurous, destabilizing tactic for China. They were actually working with the United States and backing Maoist groups against Soviet groups. This is, I mean, a lot of people were picking sides. So a lot of people were like, no, the Soviet Union is the real legacy of socialism, and they're like, no, China is the real legacy of of socialism. And then they go and they say the Mao and some this Gang of Four and stuff went as far to say that the Soviet Union were social imperialists, which was absolutely wrong. And see, and I'm looking from this point of view from a 21st century socialist. I can learn about everything, study everything, but nothing is infallible. So in my position, both the Soviet Union and China were socialists during while they were fighting against each other. And they were being manipulated against each other for the benefit of U.S. imperialism. And you can go back and look at this stuff. I believe they were both, but at that time, groups within the United States had to pick a side. So groups either became Maoists, they became Marxist-Leninist, or they became a mixture of both Marxist-Leninism with the advancement of Mao Zedong thought. And you had hoaxists, the Albanian government. People believe that Hoxha was I believe Hoxha was with the Soviet Union hardcore and supported China up to an extent and criticized the Cultural Revolution. But then they called, Soviets revisionist, after a while. Another another big turning point after the Sino-Soviet split was Khrushchev's speech. If you see behind me, there's a book by Grover Furr, which I highly recommend. It's Khrushchev Lied. Khrushchev made a secret speech and he denounced Stalin up and down from this way to Sunday. And and Grover Furr goes and tells how every single statement in that speech was a complete and utter lie. And why did he make that speech? It was to gain favor with the United States, so the United States would stop sabotaging them so much so they could actually grow. And when they did that, the U.S. kept sabotaging them. And until they eventually, until they eventually fell in 1990. But Khrushchev made that speech. And you got to remember at the time in this Communist Party USA, and a lot of different communist groups in the United States, they were still, recognized by the Soviet Union. So when Khrushchev was the leader of their aligned party, so when Khrushchev came out against Stalin, it means those parties came out against Stalin. And then some people were like, no, we're not going against Stalin correctly. And they broke away and they called themselves anti-revisionists. So that's why you get these anti-revisionism. But it's weird because revisionism has been so, used so much. It's to the point where if anybody disagrees with you on anything, then they're revisionist. And you also lost the working class character of the socialist movement. We look at the 1930s, 1940s, we had a mass Communist Party USA. On the time of William Z. Foster, there was a party within the United States with hundreds of thousands of members that led unions and organizations of millions of people. And those millions of people in those organizations worked as transition belts. So an organizer would be working in that organization. People within that large transition belt mass organization would give input to the center of the party. And that allowed it to keep it democratic. That allowed it to really represent the people. So after McCarthyism, and people are still trying to do the right thing and still bring about socialism, but anybody, the government is locking people in jail. The government is taking away people's careers. Even to this day, you go on the citizenship quiz and it says, "Are you a communist?" If you put "you are a communist," they're not even going to let you be. And you're supposed to have freedom of democracy here. You should be. I mean, technically, if you really have freedom, if somebody wanted to be a communist, they should be able to be a communist here. But you're not allowed to be a communist if you want to immigrate to this country. And that's still a very anti-democratic law that stops people from migrating the country based on their political beliefs. But so after the crush, they basically intimidated and stopped. The Communist Party kind of fell apart in the 50s. And the only people that really left were, like people that were hardcore kids, kids of Communist Party activists. And at the same time, in the 1950s, you had the growing of the labor aristocracy. The Communist Party was an organization of, for, and by the lower section of the working class. And you had things got pretty decent for white workers after, the 1950s, 1960s, all the way up into 1968, which was the height of U.S. buying power and the height of the labor aristocracy. So the entire communist movement lost its mass working class character, and it became isolated. And it with losing this power. So the time when they went from this huge organization to this small organization, and this small organization, to keep relevant, like the Communist Party USA, is basically become an instrument of the Democratic Party. And then you have small parts of that breaking off and saying they're anti-revisionist and they're the true socialists, even though they have no real connection to the masses. So anti-revisionist groups were principled. They continued to read great works like the Foundations of Leninism. They continued to read great stuff by Mao, and they continued to want to implement, study, and work along those lines. But they were isolated by the masses. And then you had infighting, you had ego trips, and it became a mess. So now you have a bunch of irrelevant cults that really have no attachment to the masses, calling themselves parties that won't work with each other, that go to the protest cages and try to recruit people in that, when those spaces are highly, controlled by CIA money, NGOs, and largely the Democratic Party. And I think there was some principled stuff, folks that went into the labor movement and did real good work. People that make publishing firms. There was a lot of good comrades still doing good work, but it was never, it lost that working class mass character of once what it was. And they were anti-revisionist. Now, let me get into this. I also want to talk a little bit. Browderism was kind of the first step. In the McCarthy era, Browder became a leader of the Communist Party, and he was not. I'm a supporter of anti-imperialist patriotism, which is, if you love the people who live in America, you should love America and want the American people's lives to get better. True American patriotism requires anti-imperialism and requires internationalism, because you cannot claim to love the people and support the monopoly capitalists, which are the imperialists who are oppressing them. And you can't fight for the people against the monopoly capitalist without standing side by side with the country, with the oppressed nations that are fighting against the same enemy. So I think true patriotism requires internationalism and requires and requires anti-imperialism. But I think the Browderist so-called patriotism was really nationalism and chauvinism to an extent. And the reason why they were pushed in that direction was because they were weak, and basically they just were absorbed into the Democratic Party. It was disintegration. They basically just disintegrated. They lost their independent power. It came from a place of weakness. Now, the American patriotism of William Z. Foster, Paul Robeson was completely different. But I would say, and they eventually kicked him out, and then you had some interesting time with Gus Hall and others, and there was positive movements, but they never really became advocates for, I would say they were revisionists. I don't like to use that term, but I believe they were revisionist. They weren't trying to build popular power. They had their place. They supported the Democrats. They stayed within academia. They never reached out to the masses. I think true socialism is popular power. So let's get into so we talked about what a revisionist was. We talked about an anti-revisionist, but we need to understand what it is that people are revising to begin with. So we're going to get in what is scientific socialism. Now, scientific socialism is not it's not an identity. It's not what you claim you are. I mean, even though I am a scientific socialist, which means I use the tool of scientific socialism, which is a science which was brought about by Marx, which is dialectic materialism, and Marx was inspired by Hegel. Hegel had the idea of dialectics, where two concepts come into conflict with each other, create a synthesis. You have a sorry if I'm gonna please get in the questions. I'll go over to questions and comments later. But the basic idea is contradictions push history forward. And Hegel was a, kind of religious and idealist. And Marx brought in the idea of materialism. Materialism is, it's not these ideas that are coming in conflict with each other. It's the material world itself. It's class contradictions that are going to push history forward. So let's talk about the different stages of history. How do contradictions push history forward? And what we have is an evolving series of modes of production. We as humans, we started in hunter-gatherer societies. And then hunter-gatherer societies became so good at hunting and fishing that they ran out of things to hunt, and they started to domesticate animals. They started to grow their own crops, and that started the agricultural revolution, which brought about slave societies. And then slave societies, where this group of, slave owners and slave holders, like in Egyptian times and others, the way they do this is they literally beat them to death, give them nothing, have no freedom over it. So this is an unstable system. People don't like being slaves. So what was an improvement from the slave society? Feudalism. And in feudalism, you went from having slaves to having peasants. Peasants live on the land. The land owns them. They work really hard tilling the land. This is agriculture society. They work really hard tilling the land, and after they pay taxes, if they have a good crop, then they have more food that year. Now there's an incentive to work. So the peasant has more freedom, has more he has more money, he has more incentive to work. It's a more efficient system. So the peasant is going to defend a feudalist society. That once the peasant feels that they have more power and more say, they're never going to want to go back to a slave society. So feudalism empowered the people, and when the people and slave revolts put, the monarchs into power. I mean, you had monarchs before, but there were slave societies. But a feudal monarch would be supported by slave rebellions. And once a slave became a a peasant, they didn't want to go back to it, so they defended. So you had a stronger system overtaking a weaker system. You had the masses of people's lives have improved material conditions, and that pushed history forward. So what was the next stage? We went from feudalism to capitalism. So in feudalism, you're stuck on the land. You can't go nowhere. You got this religious institutions that telling you there's only one church. You got to give all the devotion to church. If you do right on here, then eventually you go to heaven if you serve your Lord right and what have you. It was holding back scientific, and all knowledge came from God. Power was divine. You start to see the problem. So you had this scientific revolution, and you had the beginning of the bourgeois class, and and you had the bourgeois class start, which were traders, industrialists. They started seeing, this antiquated system holding back their power. So then you had the capitalist revolutions, and you can look back at Martin Luther. Religion is a way, religion really is a social manifestation of political order. Before you had feudal religions, and then religion, which was the social way of things, had to update itself, and that was really the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation pushed the Catholic Church to do their Reformation and adapt to the new mode of production, which is capitalism. So there was a contradiction between the rising bourgeoisie and the old feudal class, and the bourgeoisie overpowered and took out the feudal class and established capitalism. And there was also the workers. That was the main class and drive the bourgeois revolutions. But it was also an improvement for the masses of workers as well. So under feudalism, you could only be an agricultural worker. And you didn't even get money. You give part of your taxes and you barter things. There was money, but it wasn't as used. There wasn't really commodities. It was not an industrial society. It was an agricultural society. So there wasn't really much you can buy. But with, as, they started to make more goods, as the societies got more efficient, they become better at agriculture. They were able to feed these people who were not kings or peasants, but but craftsmen, blacksmiths, shoe cobblers, you name it. This group of merchants and owners in this new system. So, and workers under capitalism had more freedom. They could quit a job. They could go to another employer. They could buy more because you had the scientific revolution. There was more stuff to buy. Things were being produced more efficiently. So capitalism, and this is blasphemy to a lot of socialists, but for the time, revolutions are not an end of all oppression. Revolutions are not an end of all morality. Revolutions are a step forward, an advancement in society. Um, a lot of ultras try to put their ideal vision of society, and if it doesn't live up to that ideal vision of society, then it's not correct. But that's not how history progresses. History progresses forward in steps, in revolutions, and one class takes over another class, one system takes over another system, and what's the real driving force behind this advancement really is popular power. If you think about it, going back to slave societies and the transition from slave societies to the feudal societies, the people were better off and defended that system. So workers who had the right to choose, they still had to work for a living, had the right to choose who they worked for. They were still working for that class, and they could choose what to buy, and they didn't have to worship the only church. They started to have freedom of religion, and this was the advent of the Enlightenment era, and this was the advent of the idea of human rights. Now, and human rights is a social issue. So were all those societies before? Simply evil and barbaric? Because they didn't have human rights? No, it's because they grew the productive capacities to the point where they could ensure human rights. Human rights, equality, democracy, all need a material basis to exist. If you don't have that, you can't have that. It's like, the more scarcity you have, the the more authoritarian that society has to be. And you see this a lot with social issues. The U.S. empire, which is actually holding back history by stopping socialist countries from developing, stopping oppressed nations from escaping their system. They're actually holding back history. How they hold back history? It's because here in the United States, where we have abundance of wealth, we can send people to universities to study gender issues, to study the social issues, and then say, oh, these horrible, evil, barbaric societies like Afghanistan and China and wherever you have you, they're so horrible that we have to go and liberate them. So they're actually holding back history for the sake of social issues. They learn about our own issues and struggle, and then use them as weapons against them to hold their own power. So from this transition from hunter-gatherer societies to slave societies to capitalism, and then capitalism eventually becomes socialism, it is a more stable system because more people are empowered, and those people will defend that system. So let's bring this back into my thought of revisionism. Now, what I'm saying is popular power is never revisionist, because when you empower the people and the people have more rights and have more saying and they defend that, they're always going to be moving history forward. And moving history forward towards socialism is never revising Marxism. Marxism, Leninism is a science. And what are we trying to do with this science? Marxism, Leninism is scientific socialism, is a way of understanding the world to move it forward towards socialism and communism, and eventually communism. So empowering the masses, giving them political and economic power, and producing systems they're able to do that. And usually to produce the systems able to do that, you have to rapidly expand the productive forces to be able to facilitate this more advanced social system. So popular power will never be revisionist, because the scientific socialism is self. is all about moving history forward. Popular power will always move history forward. You empower the workers, you're moving history forward. You empower oppressed nations, you are moving history forward. It will never be revisionist. So I was trained in a anti-revisionist party builder group, and we were always taught that China is doing good, but they're revisionist because they don't have a dictator. They don't have a true dictatorship of the proletariat like Stalin and Lenin had. Same thing goes for the Bolivarian. Hugo Chavez is great and he's empowered the people, but he doesn't have that dictatorship of the proletariat like Stalin and Lenin had. This is the anti-revisionist concept. A lot of groups still say this. And I'm here to say I was wrong. I was taught wrong. I'm still an anti-revisionist. I still think working for the Democrats and disintegrating your movement into the bourgeois movement is revisionism. Taoism is revisionism. Marxism is building popular power. Marxism is pushing history forward. So I'm still an anti-revisionist, but I do not think China is revisionist. I do not think the Bolivarian revolutions are revisionist. And I can get in a little bit of this history. So a lot of anti-revisionist groups think that, their last great power. Some of them think that the Soviet Union was the greatest advancement of Marxism, and everything after that was revisionism. That's Marxist-Leninists. Marx and Lenin's Maoists believe the highest time period in history and advancement towards socialism was the Cultural Revolution. And everything past that was revisionist. And I'm sorry to say that history has continued to move forward because it is not a belief or claimed identity in a sect or a religion of scientific socialism. Scientific socialism is the science of history. Scientific socialism is the understanding of the world and using it as a tool to push it forward. And the world and the people have continued to act on the material contradictions and move history forward. So, things happen for a reason. It just doesn't go along where, they didn't implement. People are reacting to material conditions. And that is why people are acting, or a lot of anti-imperialist countries and socialist countries are responding to the absolute omnipotence, which was imperialism led by U.S. imperialism and largely still is to this day. So we can go over, the movements that have happened since Mao and since and since the Soviet Union. A lot of people will say, the Soviet Union was socialist up until Stalin's death. Now, I don't know how a economy simply stops. What is socialism? The socialist economy is when the means of production are operated or controlled by the government, which is controlled by the people, to operate and facilitate a planned economy for the benefit of the people in the country and not the rule of profits, essentially escaping the rule of profits. So how did, just because Stalin died or just because Khrushchev said a bunch of lies about Stalin, how did that completely change their economy? It didn't. It's my assertion the Soviet Union was socialist up until its downfall in the 1990s. 1990, 1991, in the fall of the Soviet Union. They still had large public work sectors, and they still had a majority of their economy was still run by the Communist Party, which had to act on behalf of the people because that was the system. They still had a socialist system. They might have started having problems with it, but it was still a socialist system. Socialism is not perfect. A lot of socialists in the United States, what they do is they want to hold on to this beautiful ideal so when they go to the masses, they tell people, this is what I'm for. This was, and then when the capitalists lie about every single socialist country, oh, I'm not them. I'm a Trotskyite. Oh, I'm this, I'm that. That's not socialism. When in reality, socialism is simply a more advanced economy. There can be a lot of injustices within a socialist society. Socialism is simply the economy run for the masses of the country. Just just as when they went from feudalism to capitalism, there was injustice that still went on. It was simply I love that comment. Thank you for coming on here, my co-host of Working Class Revolt, David Fox. Hope things are good out down under. The Soviet Union didn't collapse; it was deliberately dismantled, and you're absolutely right about that. Even though they started, it was really out of desperation. The U.S. was such a powerful force. They used such slick sabotage, and they used the CIA to go in and brainwash the kids of the elites to paint this Coca-Cola, Beatles dreamland utopia that they could have if only they overthrew their Soviet government. In the first, starting with the Eastern Bloc and eventually the Soviet Union, this very slick propaganda, they changed it from the brutal Cold War to this kind of neo-McCarthyism where, Malthusian postmodernist, nothing's real, nothing's right, which just allows the capitalists to do whatever they want. It essentially strips the middle classes from having any ideology whatsoever, and then puts the lower classes in the military, which will attack anybody who doesn't go along with their system. Great point, David Fox. So I can get back to this. So a lot of the these anti-revisionist groups will be like, Soviet Union stopped being socialist after after Stalin died, or China was socialist up until after the Cultural Revolution. China stopped being socialist when Deng Xiaoping came to power, and Deng Xiaoping put in the economic reforms and allowed for opening up and investment. That's a lot of the Marxist-Leninists, Maoists believe that Deng Xiaoping re-implemented the capitalists. They call them capitalist rotors. When in reality, the Communist Party never went out of power. And the massive, now over 90 million member Communist Party, the people still had control, had democratic, systems that controlled the central. And the central, which was based off of scientific government, simply did what was best for the country and used that investment to take people who were in absolute poverty from centuries, not from the Communist Party's policies, but from centuries of colonialism. And they were able to make this trade. You give us investment, you give us technology, allow us to expand our productive forces, and you can use our population as cheap labor. But these jobs actually improve the lives of the Chinese people, even though that's a lot less money than we would make in the U.S. Going from backwards, no infrastructure, subsistence farming to a modern industrial job in China was an improvement in the standard of living of the Chinese workers. And the Chinese people, through hours and hours of their own people's labor, have been able to essentially buy their own country's modernization and buy a massive expansion of the productive forces. And, they never were, even though they did deals with the empire and the United States, they were always firmly in control. And now that wages are rising, now that infrastructure is falling apart over here, and I think the China has actually overtaken or is about to overtake the U.S. economy as the world's largest economy. The imperialists are like, oh no, what do? We got to do something. They're so short-sighted. That is the anarchy of greed. When greed runs your system, you have no plan. You have all these capitalist interests working all for their self-interests. The country falls apart. In China, instead of going into these wars and destroying all these countries, they built up their society, built up their infrastructure, and now they're building up their neighbors around them with the Belt and Road Initiative. So what I was taught by anti-revisionist about China no longer being socialist was wrong, because it was popular power. It was the people's lives improving, pushing history forward. We are seeing the advent and the rise of a new day. Socialism has not stopped after the Soviet Union. Socialism did not stop after the chaotic, destructive Cultural Revolution. Socialism is on the march, and its the lead country today practicing socialism is China. And it wasn't just China that was on the march towards socialism. People wonder why I am so optimistic. I am so optimistic because I am seeing a new day and a new system and a new way of being and improved conditions for the people and an end to the suffering of my neighbors and my friends and humanity in general that I have a great love for no longer has to suffer under the yoke of capitalism and imperialism. There's a new system and a new society, and is being built and pushed by China. And it wasn't just China. We've had we can go back into, Cuba. A lot of Cuba was a great example. They kicked, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro stood up 90 miles off the coast and kicked out the United States. And, there was huge sanctions against them, but they have one of the best healthcare systems in the world. And then let's continue on with Latin America. Nicaragua, 1979, had a guerrilla revolution and kicked off the Samoa dictatorship. And then it's continued. You had the 21st century socialism. 1999, you had Hugo Chavez come to power, and the anti-revisionist told me, Hugo Chavez, he's good, but he's not a real socialist. Or or that company is not really socialist. And all socialism is by degree. Putting the economy underneath the control of a government that's controlled by the people. That's all socialism is. And not everything has to be under the direct control of the government. The government simply has to have supremacy. Like in China, they used Western investment. They still have workers. Richard Wolff says, that socialism is defined by the end of the relationship between the worker and the capitalist, or the worker and the manager, the worker and the owner. And that's actually not true. In a socialist system, you can have a worker and an owner. But if the economy overall is benefiting the entire society, expanding the productive forces and moving them closer to advanced stages of socialism and eventually communism, they're a socialist system. Richard Wolff is wrong about that. And he's a bourgeois academic. So, I mean, so we'll get into it. In 1999, Hugo Chavez came into power, and it was a coalition of business, of nationalist businesses. It was a coalition of the workers. It was a coalition of the rural folks, indigenous folks, Afro-Venezuelans as well. They came to power, and they said, we're tired of the neoliberal era. Largely before the 80s, the U.S. had this string of dictatorships, and it kind of transitioned in this more so-called, where you had more democratic rights, but the economy was firmly controlled. by the bourgeoisie and the imperialist. And so, let me get another drink. So when Hugo Chavez came to power, kicked out the oil companies, used another form of petrosocialism to the oil money went into schools, went into bridges, went into infrastructure, brought Cuban brought Cuban doctors over. It vastly improved the conditions of the people. The people weren't going to go back to the horrible neoliberal capitalist era. They weren't going to do that. So they're going to defend their revolution. You see that today. You see that Afro-Venezuelan fishermen, when the U.S. tried to send their mercenaries down, the fishermen defended their country because they saw the improvements in their lives in a socialist system. And all socialism needs a Soviet. A Soviet is the Workers' Council. That was the first Soviet system. If you read State and Revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat is the most democratic system while classes are still available. So I would argue Venezuela is a dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think what we're not forgetting is we act like, oh, they should have done exactly like Mao did, or they should have done exactly like Stalin did. But they're reacting to a whole new set of conditions. And they're reacting to the omnipotence, which is imperialism led by U.S. imperialism. So they had to respond to it. If they step too far over the line, then resources will be taken out of suppressing other oppressed nations, and those resources will be put in to sabotaging them or overthrowing them. So every socialist and anti-imperialist is walking on a blade. So I'm very slow to criticize a socialist or anti-imperialist country. How I see the results of an anti-imperialist country is not their claimed constitution, even though the Venezuelan constitution is great, written by the people and then signed down by the people. I'm looking at, have they given people homes? Have they improved their conditions? They improve the conditions, people will fight to keep those conditions. So I would extend this idea that they might not even call it that. But if we look at countries like Iran, the late 70s is similar with the Nicaraguan revolution. We had the largely rural population, Islamic population, kick out the Shah. And there was repression of communists and other forces. And there was also manipulation by the CIA to back so-called communist forces which they had to repress. But was there unjust repression? Yes, but I would argue they wouldn't call themselves socialists. They won't even take the name the dictatorship of the proletariat. But if you look at what the structure of a dictatorship of the proletariat is, a dictatorship of the proletariat is popular power. Popular power is a dictatorship of the proletariat. If you have the masses in power, they will bring about a future closer to socialism. So even though Iran calls themselves not socialist and not capitalist, but Islam, in reality, because they have empowered the masses, and the masses have organizations like the Revolutionary Guard that have real say over the central, they're far more democratic than bourgeois societies. And they're able to control the market. They control the market. They can plan their economy and get rid of the boom and bust cycle. And this is the main contradiction we see today is in the imperialists versus the anti-imperialist countries. China is part of the anti-imperialist bloc. Russia is part of we have this small group of monopoly capitalists and Wall Street and London that are trying to keep the order of imperialism, which is this small group of oil banking cartels. They want to keep the world poor so they can stay ahead. They don't want anyone to develop. The game is over. They want to use environmentalism. They want to use green branded austerity measures against workers and oppressed nations. They want to use woke. They're starting to use woke imperialism, saying how they're better on this socialism, better on that. But essentially, all they want to do is keep this rotten group of monopoly bankers or oil bankers in power based in Wall Street and London. And any group that wants to step outside of that, they're not going to be able to depend on their national bourgeoisie altogether, because the imperialists will be able to bribe them. It has to be a coalition of the national bourgeoisie and the workers and the oppressed forces within that country. So every anti-imperialist country needs popular power, and they need popular institutions, community organizations, workers' councils, be able to facilitate that power. And that is what we're seeing. That is what we saw in Libya. That is what we saw in Iran. That is what we saw in Nicaragua. That's what we saw in Venezuela. That is what we saw in Bolivia. We are seeing popular power push history forward. And what is the main contradiction of the day? The main contradiction of the day is imperialism led by U.S. imperialism. So there is the mass global class struggle of today is anti-imperialism. And anti-imperialism is backed by popular power, and popular power is pushing the world closer towards socialism. Popular power is never revisionist. I know I put a lot there. I'm going to go over to comments and call it a day. I kind of went ranting. I'll get better at this. So like I said, please come on 8 p.m. Saturday, tomorrow. We're going to be reading J.V. Stalin, The Foundations of Leninism, with a member of the John Brown Volunteers, Keaton Mansfield. We're going to be reading on the peasant question. We'll be reading it aloud as well as discussing that, along with Comrade David Rovics, union organizer from Australia. I'll go through a few of these comments and we'll call it a night. Here we go. Let's talk to David. David Fox. Hey, comrades. I'm just heading down to Anti-imperialist rally in Melbourne. Right on. AU, Australia, United Kingdom, U.S. military alliance to defend imperialism and intimidate the Chinese. And really the entire anti-imperialist bloc. And it's in the workers' interest in Australia. It's in the workers' interest in the United States to support the people who are pushing forward to a new system. Our salvation is not going back into the labor aristocracy. Our salvation is not going to make America great again. Our salvation is making America great for the first time by a new socialist system where we have more freedom, more power, and more material advancement to live better lives. And this small clique of oil banking cartels is holding back our future and holding back the world's future. And if we are patriotic Americans, we have to be anti-imperialist, we have to be internationalist, and we have to be socialist. And we have to build popular power to fight on our material interest along the material contradictions against the monopoly capitalists. Gordon Fiala, I can talk with you a little bit. Feudalism, capitalism are rooted in psychology. It's not about an economic and politics. It is about community society. It's antisocial to be... Okay, so I would disagree with you. I would say that the difference between feudalism and capitalism was a more advanced agricultural system. Before, I'm sorry, it is a completely different economic system. Before, the feudal lords were in power. And then in capitalism, the bourgeoisie was in power. And this was a completely different economic base. And that economic base allowed more means of production, which has allowed a better material existence, which allowed more advanced societies. And capitalism is an advancement, and it is based on a material basis on that advancement. All right, so I think Gordon Fiala, thanks for joining. That's my idea. I'm going to go on to the next. Walks and such. Thank you, Walks and Such, for coming on. Also, First Amendment law around in incement limitation on speech comes mainly from cases dealing with socialist, anarchists, and communists. Yes, they had. I mean, that it really is. Like they say, this is the difference between liberalism and communist understanding, scientific socialist understanding. We understand that all rights are dependent on an economic base. But liberal understanding is that you need that human rights, the government has to implement human rights, and that's their whole society and whole basis. But in reality, those human rights are just to make the capitalist system more efficient. It gets more people to go along with the capitalist system, which is good. But if something threatens the power of the bourgeoisie, something threatens the power of the state, if anarchists, communists, and socialists are trying to empower the working class to form a more advanced system, that system's going to fight back, and that system's going to get rid of. So you need illiberalism to maintain capitalism. Liberalism is how they paint capitalism, is how they promote it, is how they they say it's about this, it's about that. But in reality, to keep workers down and keep workers from empowering themselves, you need brutal police forces. You need brutal armies to keep whole regions dependent on Western monopolies. So liberalism requires illiberalism. All right, keep going. Shout out to Wabo Cohen. Yeah, thanks, Wabo and Cohen. Another comment for the algorithm. Post the comments in there, man. Really cool. Maybe I'll go over to your two more here. The Byzantine Empire actually did revert to a slave system to some degree. Large-scale slavery was revived almost 2.5 centuries after it died out. And there are regressions, but for the most part, the people will fight against it. If once they've seen something better, it's hard to take them back into it unless society decays. There's always exceptions to the rules. Frederick Engels pointed out in Socialism, Utopianism, and Scientific, Lutheranism was actually a reaction against the development of the more capitalist Catholicism, contrary to your claim. Oh, that's interesting. That's not what I've learned, but I'm open to learning more about that. I'm open to looking into that. Thank you. James Graham. I fish in Little Moscow Vale of Levin. The Soviet Union is still going strong. Listen, okay, that's cool. I mean, Russia isn't socialist, but they are anti-imperialist, and they do have nationalized oil and gas, and they're competing against the imperialist, and they do need a sense of popular power to enable to keep Putin and others in power. They do need popular power to keep that. Or if they didn't have any amount of popular power, they'd be crushed by the imperialist. Russia was absolutely destroyed in the neoliberal era in the 1990s. And when Putin came back to power around 2000, he nationalized the oil and improved the conditions of the people. And then they've been firmly aligned with China and the anti-imperialist bloc. So they are an anti-imperialist country. Look, Gordon Fiala, thanks for the comments. Facebook user, I'm not sure why. It's probably from, thank you for coming in from Working Class Revolt. Excellent comment. Solidarity from Glasgow, Scotland. Glad to have you on here. Thank you. James Grand. Haas Infrared put a very powerful argument for the demise of capitalism, the rise of communism last night. Riveting. Right on. I'm glad to have a large coalitions of forces. The larger the tent, the better. If we could unite oppressed people, workers, and the lower levels of capitalists, we could crush the power of the monopoly capitalist. We were to crush the power of the monopoly capitalism, we would have allies from the entire anti-imperialist bloc. And we'd be able to create a country, rebuild the society, invest in education, invest in resource, invest in infrastructure, nationalize oil and gas, and most important, nationalize the banking system. And use the banking system instead of investing in war and oil, invest in infrastructure, grow, expand the productive forces, and improve the material conditions of the people, and push us into a better society of peace, prosperity, and socialism. Keen Eltic. U.S. capitalists have been pulling trillions in profit out of China, using it against the working class. That's true. That's true. But that's the deal the Chinese made. And they were able to use that deal to lift their country up and improve their conditions. It's not the fault of the Chinese that they strategically used the deal to empower themselves. It is the fault of the capitalists here that we should be fighting against. And honestly, we can stand in solidarity if we challenge the power of the monopoly capitalists. We become allies with the Chinese, who are also the U.S. is trying to hold off all oil imports. The U.S. is trying to control the South China Sea and be able to shut down China if it needs to. And if we challenge the power of the monopoly capitalists from the belly of the beast, we will find friends with the Chinese people and their government against the common enemy of the monopoly capitalists. You cannot blame China for that. Okay, Marx mentions wage, labor, and capital. It's not only material that matters, but also social power. I think that's true. You have the base and you have the superstructure. And superstructure affects base and base affects superstructure. But you have to advance the base in order to advance the superstructure. All right, I've been on here for a minute. It's good to get my ideas out. It's good to talk. I haven't been doing these as much as I have. I'd like to try to do these every week. Maybe if I put them all on a Friday. I mean, my schedule is so hectic. It's crazy. I work, long hour weeks. I got my family to take care of. I do my Working Class Revolt show on Saturdays, 8 p.m. Eastern. Check it out. But as I say, as always, popular power is never revisionist. We need to build popular power. You need to unite as many people as possible against the monopoly capitalists. Monopoly capitalists are destroying our lives as well as the lives of the world over. And we can have a better future, a better society, if only we're able to defy the power of the monopoly capitalist. And through this, we can find happiness. We can connect with our friends, and we're feeling isolated in the capitalist system. We have this vision of a better society, a dream of a better future. We can spread this dream to our workers and neighbors, and they can feel the positive, the hope for this, and we become closer to each other. When we become closer to each other, we become happier and united in a cause. We can overthrow the system and have that better future. As always, comrades, all power to the people.